Man Up, brought to you by Construction Professionals, a program dedicated to inspiring and helping men live lives of heroic virtue. Join Joe Stopulos every Monday at 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. on Iowa Catholic Radio. And now, it's time to Man Up.
Welcome to Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. We are broadcasting from the Mercy One studio, heard on 1150 AM, 88.5 FM, and 94.5 FM. Around the globe, streaming online at iowacatholicradio.com. Please like the show on Facebook, subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I am Joe Stopulos, and today excited to have on Mark Hart. He will be joining us to discuss David as we continue in our Great Men of the Bible series. Let's start in prayer. In the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and the snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray, and do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. In the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Well, as we covered last week on the show, through the figure of Samuel, we discussed 1 Samuel, the book of that, and we really walked through his life, and we got to, well, where he was the last judge, and we had the first king with Saul. And we quickly found out that Saul was a very fallen man, and God said he would send somebody to be king who was a man after his own heart. And that man will be David. As we'll find out in today's show, David is one of the great kings of Israel. As there were so many warnings against kings in the last episode that we heard, they do, as we'll find out, have some good ones, and David was one of the best. So really excited to have Mark Hart on the other side of this break to join us to dive into the life of David and what we as men living today can learn from his example. So stick around, we're going to head to a short break, and when we return, Mark Hart will be with us.
Thank you, Construction Professionals, for underwriting Man Up. Construction Professionals have been long supporters of Iowa Catholic Radio, and we've seen their work firsthand. It's very impressive. They do remodeling or new construction that is innovative, functional, and designing what you want. cpcustomhomes.com.
Thank you, Farm Bureau agent Cindy Schulte, for underwriting Catholic Women Now. As an authorized independent agent, Cindy's team can provide health insurance options from Wellmark Blue Cross Blue Shield of Iowa. Cindy Schulte at 1315 50th Street in West Des Moines, or on the web at cindyschulte.com, 515-226-2111. Cindy and her team know health insurance.
Wellmark Blue Cross Blue Shield of Iowa is an independent licensee of the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association. Products available at Farm Bureau Financial Services.
Here's To Your Health with Dr. Carla, Wednesday mornings at 9 and online at iowacatholicradio.com or on the Iowa Catholic Radio app.
R&R Realty, helping you live your life for God through programs like Here's To Your Health on Iowa Catholic Radio.
Grail Contractor serves Des Moines and Central Iowa for all earth moving and excavating needs. Family owned since 1959, Grail Contractor will complete a project you can be proud of, on budget and on time. Grail Contractor, 515-221-9669 or grailcontractor.com.
My help comes from you. You're right here pulling me through. You carry.
And welcome back to Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. I am Joe Stopulos, today joined by Mark Hart. Mark serves as the Executive Vice President for Life Teen International, a Catholic youth ministry movement currently being implemented in almost 2,000 parishes in 30 countries worldwide, a graduate of Notre Dame University, go Irish, and a 20-year veteran of youth ministry. He's a best-selling author and a radio co-host on Sirius XM. Now, that's your official biography. I'm going to go with the Twitter biography. Executive VP of Life Teen, co-host of the Catholic Guy show on Sirius XM, author, speaker, Notre Dame alum, former Olympian. I kickbox, yodel, and groom alpacas. That's a much better biography. Mark Hart, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I mean, we could just talk about the Olympian, kickboxing, yodeling, and grooming, or we could talk about King David. Which would you rather do?
You know what? I mean, we all have our own yodeling stories, so let's talk about King David.
We'll go to King David. That sounds great. Well, as I told you earlier, and our listeners know, we're walking through salvation history through the eyes of the great men of the Bible, and this is one of those guys where we could probably do 2 or 3 shows on, but King David's such a towering figure in the Old Testament, and obviously we want to jump right into it given the fact that there's so much to cover in such a small amount of time. If you could, I personally think in order to understand King David, we have to kind of know what happened before him. Could you give us a little bit of the prequel to the life of King David?
Sure. Well, before David comes onto the scene, as it were, I think we have to remember that Israel had really had a tumultuous life. Israel as the son, as the firstborn of God, but really as a nation. I mean, that strip of land that we call Israel was the most important trade route in the world at the time. So everything coming in off the Mediterranean, everything going from up north down south into Egypt. Israel was a highly contended piece of land, which is why. I'm sure you've heard about this already in the series as you're going through salvation history. This is why it's constantly under tumult. This is why people are constantly invading it, because whoever controls that land controls the trade. He controls the trade route. So it was not by accident or coincidence that God said, "These are going to be my chosen people." But the chosen people, they had been through a lot, and after they get through the series of judges, they start clamoring. They said, "We want a king. We want a king like other kingdoms have a king." And God takes King Saul, who in the beginning, Saul was not a bad king. He was an okay guy. But as time went on, Saul, his heart left the Lord. He stopped praying. He turned inward on himself. He became a bit of a narcissist, and he didn't really trust the Lord. He was just kind of relying on his own power. And it was at this point that, because the people were not being treated the right way, God's were not being treated the right way. And what God really wanted was not a democracy. He didn't even want a kingdom on earth. He wanted a theocracy. He wanted it where he could be the king and everyone could worship him. So God turns his sights to someone, as it says in the book of Samuel, who has a heart after his own. And that is David. The name David in Hebrew actually means well-beloved. And David is the 8th and youngest son of a man named Jesse. Anybody who's ever had a Jesse tree around Advent or Christmas, that's where this comes from. And David is born in a little town called Bethlehem, which I think we're all familiar with. He is the great-grandson of a woman named Ruth, the book of Ruth. And David his older brothers are in the army. His older brothers are soldiers. David's just sort of a teenager, and he's kind of more of a right-brained, artistic type. He's out in the field shepherding. He's playing the guitar, the lyre, and he's more of a musician. So he's kind of like the youngest son. No one's really expecting much of David. He's, if all the other sons are up and coming and climbing the corporate ladder, David's the one they're wondering if he's going to go to college or not. Because he's just kind of a dreamer and a poet and a musician, and he's the youngest, so he can do no wrong.
And we talked about the parallels when I had Alan Hunt on for the Joseph episode, and there's these parallels between David and Joseph. And I want to go back to 1 Samuel 8. So the actual story of David takes place in 1 Samuel 16, and then goes all the way through that book, and then all the way through the book of 2 Samuel, and he dies in 1 Kings. So he covers about a book and a half in the Bible. But when you get to 1 Samuel 8, Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king. And he said, there will be ways the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to his horsemen and to run before his chariots. On down to verse 18 where it says, "And in that day you will cry out because of your kings, whom you have chosen for yourself, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." So again, the people were crying out for this king. And quickly, they get Saul and things go well, but then things start to fall off pretty quickly there with Saul. And we get to the point now where David is appointed as a king. And I think we're all pretty familiar with this story. That he's out in the field. The first 7 kids come through. The first 7 sons come through, and he said, "Well, none of these are mine." He says he is the 7 sons. They pass, and he said, "Is there any other one left?" And they grab David from the field. So we're all fairly familiar with that. Well, then once he's chosen and anointed, he actually goes and serves Saul for an extended period of time. I think that's interesting, that juxtaposition of how much Saul loved him at first, and then Saul's heart turns quickly.
Oh yeah, and I think in this we see that Saul really becomes a narcissist. I mean, Saul is his own biggest fan, So I think what we see in that quick juxtaposition is that David he's a charming guy, I mean, he's a likable guy. He's an up and comer. David's the kind of guy that you'd want to be buddies with. David's the kind of guy you want to have on your staff. You know what I mean? He was courageous. He was fiercely loyal. He was charismatic and very talented. But all of a sudden, when Saul started to see that that David was more charismatic than he was, all of a sudden now it turns. I mean, even though David's best friends with Saul's own son, and Saul's going to give his own daughter to David to marry. I mean, the minute he sees, David. The best part is, everybody knows the story of David and Goliath. Anybody who went to vacation Bible school, who has ever paid attention, to the world or to mass or anything,
or even just references you hear all the time anywhere.
Exactly.
Hopefully know.
we heard about David and Goliath all the way back during March Madness.
Yes,
We'll hear about it in every single playoff, right? But what's great was the funny part is David didn't set out to make a name for himself. David didn't even set out to pick a fight. If you go back into 1 Samuel, to your point, David's just taking lunch to his brothers on the battlefield. David's like a delivery guy. David's basically Uber Eats. I mean, he wasn't going out trying to pick a fight. But what ended up happening was he gets out on the battlefield and he finds that there's this Philistine warrior who's been bad-mouthing not only his nation and his army, but his God for 40 days, and all these troops are standing there motionless. And David's like, no, you're not going to do that. And what's really, really great is when Samuel comes and prophesies and lays hands on David and says, this is the one that's supposed to be the king, there's this wonderful line in 1 Samuel 16. It says, the Lord sees as no man sees, because man judges by the exterior, but the Lord judges by the heart. And it's a great lesson for all of us, especially as men. A lot of us can get wrapped up in our identity. Where do we draw our identity from? Do we draw our identity from our job, from our 401k? Do we draw it from a title, from our accomplishments, our family? And it really is a great reminder in the face of a culture that puts so much weight on that that's not how God views us. God does not view us by all those exterior things. Even though as men we're very external, we're very exterior, God judges us by our heart, by the kinds of sons we are, husbands we are, brothers we are, fathers we are, whatever we do. And what's great is that when David goes on the battlefield, we see that David, like God, does not judge Goliath by the exterior. That the same way that the Israelite army is afraid to engage Goliath, that David is not looking at his exterior. David knows his own heart. David knows that God's with him. And we see what it means to be a man after God's own heart, that you don't judge by the external situation. Because if David's out there as a teenager with a slingshot looking at the biggest, baddest warrior of the foreign army, and he starts running the numbers in his head, there's no way he's going to take that battlefield. If he's just logical. But he's not being logical because he trusts more in God's power than his own. And when this happens, the Israelite army notices this. They see this in him. They see a true leader in him. They see a bravery in him, a courage in him that's lacking in King Saul. And now the army begins to see why God has lifted up this teenager.
I would have everyone highlight in their Bibles exactly that quote. I've got it in mind. 1 Samuel 16:7. I think that's a great. I'm glad you highlighted that, which is for the Lord does not see as man sees, but man looks at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. I think it's a great first thing that all of us can take away from David. He got that great heart, and obviously that's what the Lord sees.
Yeah, and honestly, I'll be the first to say, I fall into that trap as a man. I don't know if you do. As a husband, as a father, it's easier sometimes to judge our worth, our success by accomplishments or by what we do, what we create, how we spend our day, than it is, okay, was I a good husband today? Hey, was I a good father today? And really, throughout the life of David, not to jump too far ahead, this really becomes David is really his own worst enemy. He's this charismatic leader. He's a great fighter and warrior. He's a commander. He expands the kingdom. He's on a purely like on a work sense. You know what I mean? Like in terms of accomplishments and resume. He would have been the CEO. He would have been the general. He would have been the up-and-comer. He'd been on the cover of Forbes. Like, he was very successful from that standpoint. But he really was, from a human standpoint, he was his own worst enemy. Most of his problems are self-inflicted because he has this huge appetite when it comes to sex. He has this huge appetite when it comes to power. His own marriages, his own family all kind of dissolve and devolve. He was very successful. He would have been very successful in the boardroom, but more of a failure in the family room.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get to we'll probably get to a bunch of that here in the next 10 minutes. We got to wrap up his entire life. We'll see how this goes. So, after he slays Goliath, the women had sung to one another as they made merry. This is in chapter 18. Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. And then after that, Saul was very angry. So that's kind of the turning point. He gets jealous of all these people giving David all the attention, and then it quickly turns to Saul attacking and trying to kill David. And that happens for a while here. And as you mentioned earlier, Jonathan is his best friend. So Jonathan is the son of Saul, and he marries one of Saul's daughters. So he has all these relationships to Saul, but Saul continues over the course of chapters to try to kill him. And Jonathan helps him a bunch, gives him a bunch of, hey, my dad's coming for you, watch out for him. And this kind of narrative happens for a while, and I'm just curious on your thoughts on the whole Saul trying to kill David, maybe what he learned from that.
Have you ever been in trouble with creditors and they're coming after you, they're trying to get money from you, and they're calling you?
I'm glad I haven't, but I think I could get an idea of it from this story.
I tell you, honestly, you can't. It's like you wait, and I have in my life, like you wake up with this weight and this heaviness, this nervousness, or if you feel like your job is in jeopardy, or someone in the office is gunning for you, or you just kind of have, or they have that person who's just after you on social media all the time. You kind of wake up with this anxiety, like what's going to happen today. And here's David just trying to be a faithful guy, and you have to think, because this, like to your point, it goes on for a while. I mean, Saul doesn't just chase him for a month; he chases him for multiple seasons.
The rest of the book,
for multiple seasons. I mean, and David has his opportunities to take Saul out and to kill him, and he easily could have, but he doesn't because it's not consistent with the will of God. Mm-hmm. He knows that's not what God's calling him to do. So here you have David, and you have to think that there are mornings, as much as you can follow the Lord and trust Him in your heart, there have to be mornings where you're going, okay, you called me to this. I didn't ask for this. Now I'm on the lam from the most powerful guy in the country. Are you kidding me right now? And we see this with God a lot. Actually, this is sort of God's MO. He did it with Abraham. He did it with Moses. Like he moves these great men out of their comfort zones, out of these places of comfort and out of these places of ease. And he says, "Do you trust me? Are you going to trust me? I called you to something." It doesn't mean, it's a great lesson for us still today. When God calls us to something, it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. He never promises that, but he says that if you stick with me and if you trust in me, I will make your path straight. So, but oftentimes, I think we all have to learn, especially from these great men of the Bible, these great patriarchs. If you want to follow God, if you want to live as God's son, you better get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Well, eventually, towards the end of at the end of 1 Samuel, this is not 1 Samuel 31.2 dies. He dies in war, but also so does Jonathan. And David is broken up over all of this. Well, that quickly then turns David in 2 Samuel 2. He's anointed king of Judah, and then he is anointed king of all of Israel in 2 Samuel chapter 5. So now by 2 Samuel chapter 5, David is the king over all of Israel. Now this is a very important part of all of salvation history, which is in 2 Samuel 6, when David brings the ark to Jerusalem, and then 2 Samuel 7, when the covenant is made between God and David. So I'm going to let you run with whatever you want to take with those chapters. A lot to cover.
What's important to understand, I mean, anytime we talk about the Ark of the Covenant, I immediately start thinking of Indiana Jones. I mean, how can you not? Right? If you saw the first Raiders of the Lost Ark and that Ark of the Covenant, and this was the symbol of heaven on earth, and whoever had the Ark, controlled the Ark in essence, had the power of God. But why this is so important is that when David attacks the Jebusites are the ones that are in Jerusalem. They capture the city. He goes and attacks them shortly after he becomes like the king, right? And after that, he recaptures the city and he basically consecrates the city to God. And that's why Jerusalem is called the City of David. When we hear about the Advent stories and the narratives, that's why they call it the City of David, because that wasn't the capital. He's the one that went in and took it back. Brought the ark there, establishes the capital, and now it becomes not just this headquarters, but it becomes like this almost this military compound, where this becomes this shining example, this city on a hill. And when the Ark of the Covenant comes and David strips down and he's dancing before the ark and dancing naked before the ark, and people are saying, "Oh my goodness, like how can a king do that? How can a ruler do that?" It goes and it shows not only his internal passion, but his great love for the Lord, that basically he's just going to throw all caution to the wind. Nothing is more important than God. But what we go on to see is that after he basically makes this his headquarters, brings in the ark, David, a lot of times, all these people, all these pagans, all these different cultures sound, interchangeable for us. David carries out military campaigns and beats the Amalekites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Philistines, the Syrians. I mean, everyone he went up against, he takes down. Not because he's so powerful, but because the presence of the Lord is with him. And we can't underestimate that the Ark of the Covenant was not a magic weapon, but it did show that the dwelling place of God, the presence of God was there. And when he remembered that, he was in good shape. It's when he abandoned that presence of God and he was not present to the God who was present to him that he really got himself into some hot water.
So my advice, given our short amount of time, would be there's a great Bishop Barron talk on Samuel 6 and 2 Samuel 6, 2 Samuel 7. It's a 2-part episode. Go on his podcast, listen to that, and dive into the all of the nuances of these 2 chapters, which are so pivotal in salvation history. Unfortunately, we have to get to the part where he doesn't do well, and we're going to fast forward to 2 Samuel 11, the famous story of when he commits adultery with Bathsheba. And there are so many takeaways from this story, but to your point, this is a man who was a man after God's own heart, but here he falls, and he falls hard.
Yeah, and I think, and again, I mean, most people have heard the story. I always encourage guys to go back and read it, because if you read the details, you see what happened. David was supposed to be out on the battlefield, but things are going well. He leaves his troops out there, and he goes back. Instead of leading the troops, he goes back to the palace. And this is what happens. I think this is almost like the biblical equivalent of pornography and the pandemic of pornography that exists even today. That David isn't doing what he's supposed to be doing, and when he kind of lets his guard down, before you know it, his eyes start wandering. He's in the palace. It's late afternoon. He's looking down, and he sees this naked woman. And rather than looking away, he actually calls for her and has her brought to him. And then as the story unfolds and he has relations with her, it turns out that she is the wife of one of his closest followers and a really important soldier in his army. So he calls him back, and as the story goes, basically he leaves him to die. His name is Uriah. And when Uriah won't sleep with his wife, won't kind of hopefully cover up what David did, with Bathsheba, he sends Uriah out to the battlefield, and he says, "Hey, Uriah, you charge into battle," and he tells his troops to fall back. So now he compounds his sexual sin and immorality with this grave offense towards a friend and brotherhood, and really has blood on his hands. And to your point, this is what you see. The minute we stop walking with God, the minute we let our guard down, the minute we start to read our own reviews and think too much of ourselves, and the minute we get lazy, that's when sin enters.
And this is, obviously this story is one of redemption at the end. And I think, you hear that when Nathan, the prophet, comes up to him and tells him the story, hey, we know you did this. In verse 13 of chapter 12, David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." And then there's the great psalm.
Psalm 51.
Psalm 51, which I bring to confession with me with regularity. And it's a beautiful psalm with which to just chew on, to really use as a guide of contrition, because to me it is the model of contrition. Here's a man who's fallen, who was walking in right relationship with the Lord, and who's fallen so horribly between adultery and murder and everything else, and how he redeemed himself after that incident.
Yeah, and it's always fascinating, and I love telling people this. Sometimes we don't realize this. Every single Catholic Mass, when the priest turns and washes his hands right before the consecration, it's called the lavabo, and so you have a deacon or an altar server stand there, and it's always a brief little gesture. He washes his hands, dries them off before he utters the words of consecration. The prayer that he prays in that moment is directly out of Psalm 51. "Lord, wash away my iniquities, cleanse me from my sin." He's echoing the penitence of David thousands of years later, and we do it at every single Mass because his prayer of penitence that you take to confession is so perfect and so beautiful.
Well, Mark Hart, I wish we could talk about David for 2 or 3 more episodes. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of David. The rest of the story is a lot of his of the wars he's fighting and what he's doing with the nation, and it takes you all the way through the end of 2 Samuel 7 or 2 Samuel, all the way to the end of that book, to the Book of Kings. So. Again, out of time. Wish we could have spent more time on it, but I appreciate you joining us to dive deeper into the life of David.
My pleasure. It's great to be here.
And thanks,
very much.
brother. Much appreciated. We're going to head to a short break, and when we return, we'll be right back to discuss the ending.
50 years ago, tuition costs at Catholic elementary schools were mostly absorbed by parishes. Now, higher salaries for lay teachers and new technologies have greatly increased the cost for families. Hi, I'm Jean Wells at the Catholic Tuition Organization, and my job is to reduce tuition costs for families and award great tax credits to generous donors. Want to help? Please donate today at ctoiowa.org. Let's do this for the kids and their future.
Is it time for a new roof? Then it could be time for you to get to know Bell Construction. Bell Construction is a roofing company entering its 30th year of business. They specialize in residential re-roofs, light commercial jobs, and have the experience to meet all of your roofing needs with personal service. With Bell Construction, the owner will come to your home or place of business in person to inspect and ensure the quality of work that you deserve. They pride themselves in working with you on a personal basis and making sure you are satisfied. Bell Construction, 515-963-4494.
My help comes from you. You're right here pulling me through. You can't
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. My thanks again to Mark Hart for joining us in this conversation of David. There's so many lessons to take away. Again, as I mentioned, we really could have had 2 or 3 episodes on David without much worry. One of the main lessons I look back to in the story of David is how in our own lives, our own sinfulness, how when you try to cover that up, when you try to put that behind in the closet, how it doesn't help the situation, and how we as Catholics are so lucky to have that great sacrament of confession, where we can share with God and bring those things out into the light that we've done, the places where we've fallen short. And in doing that, we free ourselves. We free ourselves to be the people we are called to be. And it's just one of the beauties of the church. And again, through the example of King David, we see that beauty lived out. Next week, we're going to move on to King Solomon, and we will have Katie Patrizio join us again to dive into his life, and she's been an awesome guest, and so we're excited to have her on next week. Thank you again for joining us today on Iowa Catholic Radio for Man Up. I am Joe Stopulos. It's time to man up.
Man Up, inspiring men to live out their call to holiness with Joe Stopulos. Heard Mondays at 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. on Iowa Catholic Radio. Brought to you by Construction Professionals.
Man Up, also underwritten by McDonald Imaging Solutions.